A man pulls the orc's holy sword. This legendary act ended the century war. There is a sword buried in the desert that no one was supposed to find, not because it was hidden, not because the path to it was dangerous, though it was, in ways that had nothing to do with beasts or bandits, but because the sword had been waiting for 100 years, standing upright in a stone altar in the middle of a wasteland that both humans and orcs had agreed, without ever signing a treaty, to pretend did not exist. The orcs called the sword Vrak Thul. In the old tongue, before the wars had carved new meanings into old words, the name meant something closer to the voice that remembers. Humans, when they spoke of it at all, which they did rarely and always in low voices, called it the Holy Blade, as if naming it something simple and reverent would keep it at a safe distance. It did not. This is the story of what happened when a man who was not supposed to be there touched a sword that was not supposed to respond. And how that single moment, one hand, one blade, one breath of purple light in the middle of a burning desert, ended a war that had swallowed 100 years and more lives than anyone had bothered to count. But before we get to the sword, we need to talk about the man. And before we talk about the man, we need to talk about the war. Dute Sunti. The war did not begin with hatred. Most wars don't. This one began with a misunderstanding so catastrophic, so perfectly timed to destroy everything it touched, that the surviving witnesses on both sides had spent a century trying to convince themselves it must have been intentional. Because intentional was easier to live with than the alternative. The alternative was that 100 years of bloodshed had started with a stolen sword and a lie that no one had the courage to correct. But that part comes later. What you need to know first is this. For as long as anyone alive could remember, the desert of Ashkorum had been a border. Not a border drawn on any map. Maps lied, and both sides knew it, but a border understood in the gut, in the blood, in the particular silence that falls over soldiers when they realize they have gone too far. To the west, human lands, farms and market towns, and a kingdom called Ashveld that had been at war so long it had forgotten what it was fighting for, only that stopping would mean admitting the cost had been too high. To the east, the territory of the Korum clans, 5 great orc clans who shared something rarer than alliance, shared grief, 100 years of it, deep enough to drown in. Between them, the desert. And in the desert, standing in a stone altar, carved with symbols that neither side had made and neither side could read. Vrak Thul. Cassian had not planned to be in the desert. He was, by his own admission, a competent soldier, not exceptional, not the kind of man stories were written about. He had joined the army of Ashveld at 17 because his older brother Beren had already joined, and Cassian hadn't been able to think of a good reason not to. He had survived 15 years of intermittent war through adequate skill, genuine caution, and the luck that visits men too tired to take unnecessary risks. Beren had not been so lucky. Beren had been the kind of man stories were written about, tall and laughing, with easy courage that made others want to follow him. Beren had died 7 years ago in the Battle of the Red Crossing. After that, Cassian had kept fighting, not for king or country. He fought because it was the only life he still knew how to live. Because stopping felt like admitting that Beren had died for something that could simply be stopped. The scouting mission that ended with him captured was the kind of assignment that gets competent but not exceptional soldiers into trouble. 3 days east of the border garrison, following reports of orc movement near the edge of the desert. He had taken 6 men. He had come back with none, not because they had been killed, but because they had scattered in the chaos of the ambush, and he had run in the wrong direction, straight into the desert, straight into capture. Straight into the hands of 4 orc warriors who marched him deeper into Ashkorum without speaking to him, moving through the heat with the fluid ease of people who had grown up treating brutal conditions as simply the way things were. And then they brought him to the altar and to the orc who guarded it. Presence, the sense that the body occupying that space had been built for a world with more gravity than the one he lived in. Pelle verde floresta, deep as old moss in shadow, lighter where scars had healed across her forearms in pale constellations. Her hair was black, pulled back in a severe rope of a ponytail fixed with dark leather. Her eyes, when they settled on him, were amber yellow, the colour of late afternoon light through glass, bright and completely unreadable. She wore armour that had been made for someone else. The leather was old, quality that didn't get made anymore, dark with age and oil and decades of use. The golden details at the shoulders and braces were worn smooth, where hands had touched them repeatedly. Someone had loved this armour for a long time before it came to her. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they did not ask for. Human, she said, not a question, not an insult, just an identification. Orc, he said, because he was tired and his wrists hurt, and apparently some part of him had decided this was a reasonable moment for his only personality trait to surface. The four warriors tensed. Ushna did not. One corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more like the recognition that a response had surprised her. Why is a human soldier in the sacred desert? Wrong direction, he said honestly. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being read, not his words, but whatever was underneath them. Take him to the altar, she told the warriors. He walks first. The altar was larger than it looked from a distance. Up close, the stone held light differently than the surrounding rock, as though it had absorbed more of it over the centuries and was considering whether to give any back. The carvings ran in concentric patterns from the base to the flat top where the sword stood, each line precise as a thought. The air around the blade had the particular quality of places where the same thing has been true for so long that the truth has settled into the ground itself. Vrakthul was beautiful. He had not expected that. Long and straight, dark metal that wasn't rusted dark, but the dark of something worked with enormous skill and then left to exist for a century in desert air that preserved everything it touched. Along the fuller ran markings matching the altar's carvings, finer than a human hand could have made. "Don't touch it," Ushna said from behind him. "I wasn't going to," he said, and then Bolrak tripped. Bolrak was 16 years old, which meant he was enormous in the body and approximately 7 years old everywhere else. He had been assigned to the rear of the escort because Ushna had learned, through 3 months of painful experience, that putting Bolrak anywhere near the front of anything resulted in complications. He was not clumsy, he was simply enthusiastic about existing. What he tripped over was a rock, an ordinary rock. What happened when he tripped was that he lurched into Cassian, who lurched into the altar, and Cassian's bound hands, extended instinctively for balance, connected with the hilt of Vrakthul. The light was purple, not purple the way a bruise is purple or a flower, purple the way lightning is white, sudden and total, and belonging to a category of things that simply are, without asking permission. It erupted from the blade in a column that went straight up into the desert sky, and for 3 full seconds, the Ashkarum had its own sun, and it was the colour of something that had been sleeping for 100 years and had just been told it was time. The sound came after, felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, the way the largest bells produce a note that is more vibration than sound. It moved through the ground in rings. In multiple distances, birds exploded into the air simultaneously, as though they had all received the same startling piece of news. Then the light faded, and the silence returned. Cassian looked at his trembling hands. Ushna had gone completely still. Her right hand had moved to her left wrist, to a strip of leather wrapped there, beneath which something small and metal caught the purple afterglow. And she held it with the kind of grip that wasn't about the object. It was about needing something solid. "What?" said Bolrak in a voice that had gone very small for someone his size. "Did I just do?" 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Cassian learned several things. He learned that desert nights were cold in a way that desert days gave no indication of. The temperature dropped with the sun and kept dropping, until the air had the dry, sharp quality of breathing through metal, and the stars above Ashkorum were so numerous and so bright they looked painted, arranged rather than scattered. He learned that Ushna slept less than anyone he had ever met. He would wake in the early hours, and she would be standing near the altar, not touching it, just standing close to it, the way people stand near things that have hurt them, too close for comfort, too close to look away. He learned that Bolrak asked an average of 47 questions per day. "Does it hurt when humans cry?" Bolrak asked on the second morning. "Orc tears are heavy. They hurt coming out." "It doesn't hurt," Cassian said. "Then why don't you do it more?" Cassian did not have a good answer for that. On the third day, Mirek arrived. She walked out of the eastern shimmer of heat on the horizon with the purposeful calm of someone who had known they would end up here and had taken their time about it. She was small for an orc, ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, not diminished by age, but distilled by it. Her right eye was cloudy, half closed. Her left eye was white, not the white of blindness, but a smooth, polished white, the colour of river-worn bone, set into the socket as though it had grown there. She walked barefoot through the desert. The soles of her feet, when she stepped, made no sound. She stopped in front of Cassian and looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You've been carrying something that doesn't belong to you." "The sword touched me," he said. "I didn't touch it. That's not what I meant." She tilted her head. "What was the last thing your brother said to you?" The silence that followed had weight. Real weight, the kind that presses on the chest. Cassian had not spoken about Beren to anyone in a very long time. He had thought around those words, the way you learn to walk around furniture in the dark, feeling its presence only when you stub your toe. "He told me to go home," Cassian said finally. "The morning before the battle, he said the war would end eventually, that I should think about what I wanted to do after." Mirek nodded, as though this confirmed something she already knew. "And now?" she asked. "He didn't come back, so now I don't think about after." Behind Mirek, Ushna had emerged from the tent. Her hand was on her left wrist again, fingers pressed against the leather binding. "Show him," Mirek said. "Beam." Ushna crossed the distance between them, 12 steps on ground that seemed to take effort to cross, and stopped in front of him, close enough that he had to look up slightly. She unwound the leather from her left wrist. The fragment was roughly 3 fingers wide and 2 long, a shard of dark metal with one straight edge and one ragged edge where it had broken from something larger. It hung from a thin cord of twisted sinew, worn against the skin for so long that the cord had left a pale impression in the green of her wrist. Even from this distance, Cassian could feel it. The same low resonance the altar produced, but quieter, a note at the edge of hearing. "My father wore this until the day he died," Ushna said. Her voice was flat, controlled in the way of someone who has practiced controlling it so long. The effort has become invisible, but not quite invisible enough. "He told me it was a piece of Rakthul, that it had broken from the blade during the battle 100 years ago, that our clan had kept it because the shamans said it was important, that one day—" She stopped. "What?" Cassian asked. "One day it would fit back where it came from." She looked at the fragment, not at him. He believed that. He died believing the war would end in his lifetime. He was wrong. How did he die? Her amber eyes moved to his face, slow, measuring. "The Battle of the Red Crossing," she said. 7 years ago. The sound the desert made in that moment was nothing. Total silence. The kind that comes when the world understands something significant has just been said and gives it room. "My brother died there," Cassian said. "That morning." Ushna looked at him and said nothing. Her jaw was tight. The fragment shifted slightly in the hot desert air, catching the light the way pieces of broken things catch light. Fully, honestly, without trying to look like anything other than what they were. "They killed each other?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I only know he didn't come back." He said, "I'm sorry." She did not answer for a long moment. Then, "Your hands trembled when you touched the sword." "Yes, they tremble now." He looked down. "They did." "I know," he said. Mirek told them the truth on the 5th night. She had spent 2 days making preparations that she did not explain, and which neither Cassian nor Ushna, nor especially Bolrak, who had tried to ask about them 14 times, was invited to understand. She burned something at the base of the altar that smelled like cedar and old copper, and something beneath both that had no name he knew. She spoke to the sword in the old orc tongue, long and low, in the tone of someone completing an obligation they have been putting off for a while. On the 5th night, she sat between them at the fire and told them what the prophecy actually said. Not what it had been translated as, not the version passed down through shamans across a century of whisper-broken repetition. The original. The one carved into the base of the altar in markings that neither side could read, because neither side had spoken the original tongue in generations. Mirek could read it. She had been able to for 40 years. "You kept it secret?" Ushna said. Her voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. "I was afraid," Mirek said simply. "What I can see, and what I have the courage to say, have not always been the same thing. I'm old enough to admit that." "What does it say?" Cassian asked. Mirek looked at the fire. The flames moved across her face, lighting the bone-white eye from odd angles, so it seemed occasionally to hold reflections of things that weren't there. "The prophecy was never about the sword," she said. "Vrakthul is not a weapon of war. It was never meant to be wielded in battle. The carvings say it is a sword of ending, not of enemies, but of conflict. It responds to the one who is willing to put it down." She paused. "Every warrior who came before tried to claim it. The sword knew metal remembers intention even when hands do not." She looked at Cassian. "You did not come to take it. You did not come for it at all. Your hands reached for it because you were falling, because you were afraid, because you needed something to hold." She turned to Ushna. "The sword woke up for that, not for strength, for honesty." The fire crackled. A nightbird made a sound like something being gently torn. "What does the one who wakes it have to do?" Ushna asked. "He must lift it. In front of both armies, every warrior of the Korum clans and every soldier of Ashveld. He must lift it and then—" Mirek stopped. "Then what?" Cassian said. "Then he must give it back." The silence that followed had the quality of something arriving. Like weather, felt before it was visible. He understood in that silence what was being asked of him. A human man, a soldier of Ashveld, standing in front of every orc warrior who had spent a century treating his kind as the enemy, holding their most sacred object, and choosing, not in a moment of battle or desperation, but deliberately in full sight of everyone, to return it. "They'll think it's a trick," he said. "Yes," Mirek said. "My own people will think I've lost my mind. Also, yes, someone will probably try to kill me. Almost certainly, yes." She paused. "The question is not whether it will be difficult. The question is whether you understand what you are being asked to do and whether you are willing to do it." Cassian stared at the fire. "Why me?" he said. "Out of every human alive, why?" "Because," Mirek said, "you are a man who has been fighting for 7 years without knowing why, and that is a man who is ready to stop." But he did not answer that night. He lay on his bedroll in the desert cold and looked at the stars and thought about Beren, who had told him to think about after. He thought about Ushna's face when she had said, "I only know he didn't come back." The same face he saw in metal surfaces when he shaved. The face of someone carrying something too heavy for too long, who had stopped noticing the weight because the weight had become indistinguishable from themselves. He thought about the fragment on her wrist. About a man who had died carrying a broken piece of something, believing it would one day fit back into place. About whether believing that had made the dying harder or easier. At some point, between the coldest hour of the night and the first grey suggestion of dawn, Ushna appeared and sat beside him. Not close, not far. The way you sit near someone when you're not sure of the welcome but have decided to try anyway. They didn't speak for a while. "I can't make you do this," she said finally. "I know. Mirek says the prophecy requires choice, that if you did it unwillingly it would mean nothing." A pause. "I don't know if I believe everything Mirek says. She's been right about most things so far. She kept the truth for 40 years. She said she was afraid." He looked at her profile, the strong line of jaw, the single small tusk visible at the corner of her mouth, the fragment at her wrist where the leather had shifted. "Have you never been afraid of a truth long enough to stay quiet about it?" A long pause. "Yes," she said. "What truth?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. The desert around them was very still. All the nighttime sounds settled, the daytime sounds not yet begun, a brief window of silence that felt intentional. "That the war should have ended before I was born," she said at last. "That every year it continued was a choice, not an inevitability. That my father didn't die for something necessary." Her hand found the fragment without her looking at it. That his death was one in a series of deaths, that none of them had to happen. Cassian was quiet. "My brother told me to go home," he said. "I told him I didn't know what that meant anymore. He said home isn't a place you have, it's a place you make." He looked at the sky, where the stars were beginning to lose ground to the coming grey. "I never understood what he meant. I think I'm starting to." Ushna looked at him. He looked back. In the pre-dawn dark, her eyes were less amber, more simply bright. Two lights in a green face that was exhausted and uncertain, and doing its level best not to be either. "If you do this," she said, "I will stand with you, in front of both armies, whatever comes." "They'll call you a traitor," he said. "They'll call you worse." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, but close. "The cousin of one. I am the guardian of the altar. If I say the prophecy is fulfilled, my clans will have to listen. Eventually." "And your father's honor?" he asked. She looked at the fragment. "My father spent 30 years carrying a broken piece of something," she said, "waiting for the day it would fit back into place. Maybe honoring him means finishing what he was waiting for." The sun began tentatively to arrive. The summoning of both armies took 2 weeks. Mirek sent messengers in both directions. Bolrak rode east, harder than Cassian had seen anyone ride. Ushna sent 2 warriors west, with a released prisoner, as proof that the orcs wanted to speak rather than attack. Those 2 weeks, Cassian and Ushna lived at the altar and talked, in the way that people talk when there is nothing useful to do, and the alternative is silence that has started to feel too heavy. He told her about Beren, not the battle, but before. About a boy 7 years older who had taught him to ride and laugh so easily it felt like a natural resource. About a winter morning when they had gotten lost in the woods, and Beren had told him stories the whole way home so that Cassian would be too interested to be afraid. She told him about her father, a chieftain who had spent his evenings carving small animals from wood for the children of the clan. A man who believed in the prophecy because he had decided that the world he was living in could not be the world that was meant to exist, and so he would believe in something better until it arrived. "I miss him in ways that don't make sense anymore," she said. "I thought grief had a limit, a depth you eventually reach and then stop falling." "It doesn't," Cassian said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Bolrak returned on the 6th day with confirmation. The Korum chieftains were coming, all 5 clans, nearly 3,000 warriors, because the word that had gone east was simply, "The sword has woken." No orc who heard those words could stay away. The human response arrived 3 days later. A captain named Hadwin, iron gauntlet where his left hand had been, face arranged into the expression of a man prepared to be wrong about everything while hoping desperately not to be. "You've lost your mind," he said. "Probably," Cassian agreed. "Are they coming?" 3,000 infantry and a priest who has told me 6 times this is blasphemy. The iron hand clenched. "This is an orc trick." "No one is using me," Cassian said. Something moved in Hadwin's face, the expression of a man who has organized his identity around an enemy and just encountered something that doesn't fit. He turned his horse. 3 days. If this is a trap, I will make sure you live long enough to regret it." Chitty. The armies arrived on the same morning, from opposite directions. Cassian heard the Korum clans before he saw them. The drums reached him first, deep, boom, boom, boom that made the ground vibrate in a way his body registered before his ears did, then the sound of feet. Thousands of them, moving in the particular cadence of orc warriors who had been marching since before dawn. He heard the human army second, the clatter of armor, the squeak of wagon wheels, the murmur of soldiers filling empty space with conversation, the way people fill empty rooms with light. He stood beside Ushna in front of the altar as the two armies arranged themselves in the desert and looked at each other across the space they had been looking across for 100 years. The hate in the air was something you could feel on your skin, like heat but colder, the specific cold of something that has never been allowed to cool down naturally. Bolrak stood behind Ushna. He was trembling visibly. His hand was on his left tusk, touching it repeatedly, the way he did when he was thinking hard. But he was standing there. Mirek stood beside the altar and looked at the assembled armies and seemed, if anything, calmer than she had been at any point in the past 2 weeks. Ushna turned to Cassian. "Now," she said. He turned to the altar. He could feel 6,000 pairs of eyes on him, human and orc alike, holding whatever they were feeling behind whatever faces they had chosen for this moment. The held breath of it. He put his hand on the hilt of Vrakthul. The light came again, slower this time, as though the sword was doing it deliberately. Purple, deep and clear as the center of a flame, rising in a column that climbed until it was higher than any building Cassian had ever stood next to. The resonance came with it, in the bones and the ground, and somewhere below both, a note that the desert remembered from somewhere before the war. He lifted it. It was not heavy. Sacred things in stories were always heavy, as though spiritual significance had literal mass. But Vrakthul came free of the altar with the ease of something that had been waiting to be moved and had made up its mind to cooperate. He raised it above his head. The reaction moved through both armies like a wave, not sound, not movement, but something that went before both. A collective intake of breath, the particular shock of thousands of people simultaneously encountering something they did not believe was possible. He lowered the sword. He turned to Ushna. She was standing very still. Her amber eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the sword's light. Her hand rested near the fragment at her wrist, not touching it now. Just near it. He held the sword out to her, hilt first. "I believe," he said loudly enough that the silence carried it to both armies, "this belongs to your people." What happened next did not resolve cleanly, because nothing real resolves cleanly. Hadwin rode forward with his iron hand raised and called Cassian a traitor in front of both armies, and the word traitor sat in the air between them. Cassian looked at him. "Hadwin," he said, "how long have you been fighting?" "What?" "Count the years." A pause. 23 years. "What for?" The silence stretched. Around them, 6,000 people listened to an exchange that neither army had been prepared for, which is to say, a real one. "For the kingdom," Hadwin said finally. For what you lost," Cassian said, not unkindly. "I know. Me too." He looked at the iron hand, then at Hadwin's face. "But we've been paying for losses by making more losses, and I don't want to do it anymore." Something moved in Hadwin's face, the particular movement of someone confronting a thought they have been outrunning for a long time. He did not move his horse forward. On the orc side, a young warrior from an outlying clan who had not been part of Ushna's band drew his blade and started forward, a man who saw a human holding a sacred weapon and responded with everything a century of war had taught him to respond with. Bolrak stepped into his path, 16 years old, enormous in body, standing between an angry orc warrior and whatever was happening, with his hand on his left tusk and his feet planted. "Wait," Bolrak said. The warrior looked at him. "I was there," Bolrak said. "When it lit up, I was there." He seemed to be assembling an argument from pieces he hadn't arranged before. He didn't take it. He fell. It chose him because he wasn't trying to claim it. He looked at the warrior with the intensity of a very young person who has just understood something and cannot believe the adults around him haven't figured it out yet. The sword didn't want a warrior. We've been sending warriors for 100 years. It wanted someone who was already falling. The warrior stared at him, then at Cassian, who was still holding the sword out to Ushna. Then he lowered his blade. Ushna reached out and took Vrakthul from Cassian's hands. The moment she touched it, the light intensified. Not dramatically, not in a column to the sky, but warmly, the way a fire responds when you add wood that was ready to burn. The sword settled into her grip the way things settle when they have arrived where they belong. She held it for a moment. Then she turned to the altar and placed it back in the stone. Not because a human forced her to, not because the prophecy commanded it, because her father had spent 30 years waiting for the day it would fit back into place, and she was finishing what he had started. Then she reached to her left wrist and unwound the leather binding. The fragment hung on its cord of sinew, catching the sword's warm light. She pressed it against the notch in the fuller where it had broken away 100 years ago, in a battle that should never have started. It fit. Of course it fit. It had always been meant to fit. The metal sealed around it with a sound like a quiet exhale, as if the sword had been holding its breath and had finally, after a century, been allowed to stop. The treaty took 6 more months to negotiate. Nothing that's significant happens quickly, and it would be dishonest to pretend that 2 armies stood in a desert and a sword lit up, and suddenly a century of war was simply over. It was not over. It had to be ended, piece by piece, by people who were tired and grieving and suspicious, who had to learn to sit across from each other without their hands going to their weapons, which took practice. Edwin did not sign the treaty. He retired to a farm in the Western Hills, and nobody blamed him for that. Some wounds have been opened so long that closing them requires a surgery the patient cannot survive. Volrac became, improbably, one of the principal translators at the negotiating table. It turned out that 16 years of asking humans inappropriate questions with complete sincerity had made him the person in the room most capable of saying difficult things without making them sound like attacks. He asked, at the 3rd session, whether everyone could agree that the war had been about real losses and real grief, and that acknowledging that did not require pretending those losses hadn't happened. The room went quiet. Then the chief negotiator from Ashveld said yes, they could agree to that. It was the first thing both sides agreed on. They built from there. Mirek lived to see the treaty signed. She died the following winter, not dramatically, not as consequence of anything, but simply because she was very old and had done what she came to do, and the body knows when the work is finished. The night before she died, she asked Ushna to bring her to the altar. She sat at its base for several hours without speaking. Ushna sat beside her and also did not speak, because Mirek had said what needed saying, and silence was more respectful than filling the space. In the morning, Mirek told her one last thing. I was afraid for 40 years, she said, but I was also watching, waiting, trusting that the right moment would come, even when I couldn't see it. She looked at Ushna with her good eye. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait 40 years to say the true thing. She died the next day quietly, with her boots off, which was how she had lived most of her life. Cassian did not go back to Ashveld permanently. He went once, to the village where he had grown up, to the grave marker placed in the family plot 7 years ago with Beron's name on it. He stood there without knowing what to say. He had spent 7 years not knowing what to say. Eventually he said, You told me to think about after. I'm starting to. He returned to the border. Not to fight. There was no fighting anymore, or less of it, or the kind of fighting being handled through negotiation rather than casualties. He returned because there was work to do in the space where war had been, and the work required people who could stand in the discomfort between 2 worlds without needing it to resolve into a comfortable single thing. He was, as it turned out, moderately good at that. Ushna was still at the altar when he came back. She would always be at the altar in the sense that the altar was her responsibility, and she took responsibilities seriously to the point where it had become structural. But she was also at the negotiating tables, at the border markets, in the newly established garrison staffed by both orc and human soldiers who were being asked to trust each other with their lives. Which was difficult, which was also the whole point. The fragment never came back out of the blade. You had to know exactly where to look to find the line where it had been reintegrated, and even then it was more felt than seen. A slight difference in the texture of the metal, a warmer quality to the light there. Ushna touched it sometimes when she stood at the altar. Where the fragment used to be, on her wrist, there was a pale mark where the cord had pressed against her skin for years. She touched that too, occasionally, the way people touch old scars, not because they hurt, but to remember that the healing happened. Some things that are broken can be made whole, not the way they were before. You can always see the seam if you look closely enough, but whole in a different way, stronger at the break if the break is handled right. The war ended, not cleanly, not without cost and grief, and the long, difficult work of people choosing every day to do the harder thing instead of the easier one. The first mixed market at the border drew only 6 humans and 4 orcs. But at the end of the day, a human child held the hand of an orc child without flinching. And Ushna stood at the edge of the market and understood that she had planted something she might not live to see fully grown. That real change doesn't happen in a generation. It happens slowly, like water shaping stone, imperceptible day to day, but inevitable across the years. She would not see the world she was building, but those who came after her would. And she had decided on a cold desert morning before the sun arrived and 2 armies waited in the sand that this would have to be enough. It was. Some swords are meant to be lifted, and some are meant to be put down. The hardest part always is knowing which moment you're in. If this story moved you, if you found something in these 2 people and this broken sword and this desert that felt like something you needed today, then take a moment before you go. Think about the thing you've been holding on to, the conflict you keep fighting because stopping feels like losing, the truth you've been too afraid to say for longer than you want to admit. Cassian held a sword for 30 seconds. Ushna held a fragment for 7 years. Mirik held a secret for 40. What are you holding? If you want more stories like this, stories that don't pretend the world is simple, that give their characters the space to be broken and complicated and still capable of extraordinary things, subscribe to Orcbound Tales. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And leave a like if you believe some things are worth putting down. In the comments below, tell me about a moment when you realized you'd been fighting something that was ready to end. I read everyone. Until next time. Loktar.